Doesn't look like we have anyone coming in yet.
No, they're coming in.
Oh, there's
Sorry.
one person.
Yeah.
Hello, welcome, David. We're expecting a few more people, so they'll be coming in soon. All right, so people are slowly coming in. As you're coming in, please let us know where you're tuning in from, and what brought you here this morning. I was going to say evening. I usually do evening programs. Or yeah, let us know what brought you here. So far, we have David, Geraldine, Jean, Linda. Welcome. We'll get started very soon. In the meantime, I will put in the chat a link to the book. I now have to do this again once more people come in, because they won't see it. And we'll just go ahead and get started, and I'm sure people will join us. Hello, I'm Omar Acevedo, and I'm the Literary Program Coordinator here at the Mark Twain House Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. Thank you so much for joining us for this virtual program for Nobody's Fool, Why We Get Taken In and What We Can Do About It. First, I want to thank our sponsors. Our virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring the late Frank Lord. We are happy to honor his memory with these programs. And we are also incredibly grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting all of our virtual programs. I know that many of you on this, I was going to say call, but at this program right now, are members and or have donated and or have attended many of our programs. But if you know someone who is interested in becoming a member, please send them to our website. Let them know that our members receive free admission to our author programs, the House and Museum, year-round discounts in the store and cafe, and much more. I'll put a link in the chat for that as well. You can send that to your friends and family. Now on to our guests. Our first author, Daniel Simmons, is a professor Simon, sorry about that.
That's okay.
Is a professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Illinois, where he directs the Visual Cognition Laboratory. Our second author, Christopher Chabris, did I say that correctly, Christopher? Is a cognitive, thank you, is a cognitive scientist who has taught at Union College and Harvard University. Our moderator, Diana B. Henriquez, is a prize-winning financial writer who is the author of many books, including the New York Times bestseller, The Wizard of Lies, Bernie Madoff and the Death of Trust, The White Sharks of Wall Street, and Taming the Street, The Old Guard, The New Deal, and FDR's Right to Regulate American Capitalism, to be released in September 2023 by Random House. We encourage you to have a conversation in the chat. If you have a specific question, please post that directly into our Q&A section that is on the bottom left of the screen. You can also click on live captions to see live auto captioning, and I'll actually turn that on now for the program. And finally, I put a link in the chat to purchase Nobody's Fool through our museum store. Your purchase will support our museum and our honored guests. So please sit back and enjoy the conversation, and I'll turn this over to Danielle, Christopher, and Diana.
Thank you, Omar. I'm delighted to be here with these two folks. I feel like I've known them for years because their incredible, groundbreaking book, The Invisible Gorilla, gave such insight to me as I was examining how people got pulled into the Bernie Madoff scandal, the largest Ponzi scheme in history. And you'll learn more about that process in the new book. But first, I want to tee up for Chris and Dan. After The Invisible Gorilla, which was so insightful, why did you decide that this new book was necessary? Was there some aha moment that set you on the path to Nobody's Fool, that carried it that good bit further?
Well, I'd say we wanted to write another book shortly after we finished Invisible Gorilla. We really enjoyed the process, and we started collecting materials, and a lot of the material we collected for Invisible Gorilla didn't end up in the book, of course. So as you know, as a book author, there's often a lot of stuff that just gets sent to the cutting room floor.
And we regret every bit of it, don't we?
Exactly. It's often wonderful stuff, but just doesn't quite fit.
I try to slam it into the footnotes, but then the editors eventually put a halt to that.
Yeah, we do the same thing. But yeah, so we were collecting interesting research and stories and ideas, and we were doing that for some years, and we kept trying to kind of piece it together and think about what would make a good coherent story. And we had several false starts and kind of dead ends where we put something together and we might have even run some of them past our agent, and it's like, yeah, it just didn't work. So it took us a while. It was really maybe about 3 years ago, Chris, that we kind of came across a way of putting it all together, which was, we realized a lot of these stories had to do with how people were deceiving other people or how we were deceiving ourselves. And that organization kind of came together when we realized that we could see the commonalities across this wide range of cons, scams, and just run-of-the-mill deception, including things like the Bernie Madoff case, that they all tapped into some of the same sorts of cognitive processes and cognitive tendencies that we have. So that became sort of the organizing theme. What are the sort of ways of thinking that work well for us most of the time, but that can be sort of hijacked for other purposes? And what are the sorts of information that kind of grabs us?
Right. So, Chris, it was more evolutionary rather than sort of a eureka moment.
I would say yes. I would maybe add one other thing to it, which was we were very gratified that The Invisible Gorilla did so well. And by the way, if anyone is interested in it, here's what it looks like. But one comment that we got was The Invisible Gorilla was sort of a book about how our instincts are wrong, about how our own minds work, basically about our cognitive limitations. And we didn't really say much about, here's how you can overcome all these problems. I mean, to give that kind of advice would be sort of trite anyhow, because the one thing everybody should know is that the one weird old tip, never actually works to solve a complicated problem, like being a better decision maker or something like that. Right. But I think it occurred to us over time, and especially about 3 years ago when we were really, getting into actually writing this thing, that the one time you really do want to make sure you make your best decisions is when someone is out there actively trying to get you to make a bad decision. And that's exactly sort of the category of things that our book is about, because most of the time that involves some kind of deception, misinformation, outright fraud, something like that. It also just occurred to me while listening to you ask the question, maybe I was primed by you having written the book on Madoff, that I did have some students when our book came out read the book, and we did some discussions of it and discussions of chapters of it. And I asked them to write an essay about a similar, about a story about something that wasn't in our first book, but they thought would be maybe relevant to it. And one student wrote about Bernie Madoff, which had sort of hit the news, not that long ago. And I think maybe she had a relative who was involved somehow or whatever, but that kind of actually led me to think, oh, that's, there's a whole category of things that we really hadn't thought about that much, in the first place. And so I think it was a very natural flow to sort of think about what are the cognitive patterns that lead us into those kinds of traps.
Right. Well, I was so delighted to see that you did address the Madoff issue within it, because invariably I find people at gatherings that I address as an author who say, oh, well, I never would have fallen for Bernie Madoff. Everybody knows you can't fool an honest man, or you can't cheat an honest man. And if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. When in fact, when you're dealing with con artists of the kind of deceptive talent that we've seen. And since we're built the way we are, as you guys so clearly demonstrate, the fact is, as one fraud analyst said, if it sounds too good to be true, you're dealing with an amateur. I mean, actual professionals know to never make it sound too good to be true. And we think we're defended against this kind of deception when we're really not. And that's what makes Nobody's Fool so exciting to me. But let's talk about that element of trust, because it's so fundamental to your story. It was so fundamental to the Madoff story that I actually used it in the subtitle, Bernie Madoff and the Death of Trust, because we know, I mean, there's very good economic research that shows that there's a correlation between high trust levels in a society and economic flourishing. But clearly, as the stories in your book show, we often trust too much for our own good. So how do we find that optimal level of trust that's enough to sustain a healthy society, but not so much that we're falling prey to con artists like Bernie Madoff or the next 5 Bernie Madoffs?
Well, ironically, the higher the level of trust in society, the more prey there is for someone who is willing to violate trust, right? So it's sort of like, yeah.
That's certainly true.
Once you have no defenses anymore. Yeah, exactly.
I often said that the way to get to eliminate Ponzi schemes is, massive clinical paranoia across the entire society. And that would do it. I mean, once you don't trust anybody, you're no more Ponzi schemes, but we can't function
no more
that
functioning
way.
either. Yeah.
Precisely.
Yeah, sure.
So talk about that balance for us.
Well, I think one thing to say is that trust can have a lot of different meanings. And one thing we tried to do in our book was sort of unpack what people mean by trust when it comes to becoming deceived. And I think there was an eloquent quote from a victim of the Madoff scam who basically summed it up quite simply. Upon being advised by someone who actually had some knowledge that you don't want to give all your money to this one guy, and this might be a scam, and nobody knows how he's doing this, and you should avoid it. His response was, they don't understand. Bernie would never screw us. And I think, Bernie would never screw us is kind of, in a way, the kind of commitment, as we call it. It's sort of an assumption that you can't shake, that is a permanent assumption. And once you assume that Bernie would never screw us, well, then your trust is such that you will rationalize anything else that's happening, even these weird statements that he's sending people, and the fact that the fact that his returns are too consistent, any of that information, but he would never screw us. So that's, I think, in a way, the commitment that someone is being totally honest is maybe what we would describe as trust. And then how to balance that out, we have several ideas on that. I think the most important one in my mind is to weigh the stakes of the decision you're making and calibrate the level of distrust or of checking or of inquiring further with the stakes that are involved. That's a fairly obvious heuristic, but I think surprisingly, as you would know, and as people who looked at the Madoff case and many, many others have seen, people will make huge decisions with very little, consideration, no checking, nothing more than a reference from a cousin or something like that they see once a year. That's not the right level of calibration of checking to trust.
Let me amplify one point, which comes back to something you said a moment ago, which is a lot of people, when they learn about a scam, even much smaller scams than the long-running Madoff one, they'll say, oh yeah, I would have never fallen for that, as you said. And the standard idea is that, well, if it's too good to be true, it is. But the problem is that people really vary in what they think is too good, right? So some people will say, oh yeah, if somebody offers them 40% returns in a month, right, any savvy investor is going to say, no, that's way too good to be true, right? But if you're not a savvy investor, it might be exactly what you hope for, right?
And even if you are a savvy investor, con artists will adapt. At a period when treasury bills were paying less than 1.5% interest. If I'd come to you with a great sterling reputation and said, I've got a great short-term, low-risk bond fund that's paying 2.5%, that would not sound like a Ponzi scheme to anybody. And yet it would have to be, because you can't fit the highly liquid short-term bond fund definition when the only likely investments are paying 1.5% and pay me 2.5%. So exactly. they're very adaptable, and we're really fooling ourselves if we think that we're going to see them coming. Those 40% a month returns are really an artifact of the old Charles
days.
Ponzi days.
Yeah.
The old.
Although I still get
Okay.
emails with those sorts of scams, and then the crypto
Do
ones
you?
are often that, right?
Oh, I think I
Um,
must have fallen off
they're-
those email
Yeah,
lists.
they're often promising 40-50% returns a year in some of the crypto scams. But what's
Oh.
interesting again is that there are people who will fall for that, right? And there are plenty of people who won't, right? So what threshold people set for too good to be true varies a lot across people. So one of the things that plays into the trust question is ask somebody else, right? It's a simple bit of advice, but ask somebody else and take their answer seriously. If they don't have the same mindset that you do, they aren't kind of looped into it. They don't necessarily think that, Bernie would never screw us. Asking somebody else and taking their opinion seriously to evaluate it can be a good way of sort of checking yourself. And whether your hopes are kind of being fulfilled by somebody who's very good at selling to you.
Are we set up as a society to do that kind of almost trust checking, not fact checking, but trust checking? What would you advise if someone said to you, I've gotten this offer, who should I talk to? What would a lot of the institutional answers don't satisfy people anymore. Talk to your financial advisor. Oh, he's playing for commissions. I can't trust him. Talk to your bankers. Oh, you can't trust bankers. How do you deal with that collision of mistrust and too much trust?
Well, I don't know the exact right answer to who you should talk to when you get an investment offer. That's maybe more of your area of expertise. But I do know that we are generally unaware of how little expertise we actually have on many topics. So I think if you would just stop and say, do I even know enough to decide one way or another? First step, right? Do I even know enough to decide one way or another? What do I really know about bond funds and 2.5% versus treasury bills and so on? Do I know anything about that at all? Just asking that question might stop a lot of people from making a mistake. So it's not necessarily that they need to find the person who knows the most, or at least the person they trust who knows the most. Just realize what they don't know. And you're not required to invest in a bond fund that's offering, a 1 basis point above the treasury bills or whatever. You're not required to do that with your money. You can keep your money where it is, for the moment. And then also, I want to be old fashioned about it for a while, but there's some good old sources of information called books and, encyclopedias and, and so on that do have really solid information. Like what is the long run expected return from the stock market? What are interest rates typically? What do these products mean and so on? And they won't answer every question, but I can't help but believe that, acquiring some knowledge yourself, especially on something so important as where you put all your money, that's not something you want to really skimp on, trying to have at least some understanding of the basic facts. I sound like some old-fashioned, school teacher or professor type, but I think that's a good starting place. And then maybe that'll give you some more ideas, like who you should be talking to, who you could trust, who you couldn't. Once you learn that certain financial advisors operate on sales commissions, you might then think, oh, well, I should evaluate their advice in light of that understanding. But if you don't even know that, then you might go to the wrong source, right?
There's a way you can find out if you know it, which is to ask yourself, how would I tell if this was a scam? Right. And if you just ask yourself that, you'll realize I have no idea how I would tell, because I don't actually know anything about how Bitcoin works, right? Or I don't know anything about how.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. And just for people who are interested, the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission in Washington, at sec.gov has a plethora of informative papers and Q&As about investments and investment scams that would be a great starting point for people who want to educate themselves. But I love that question. I'm going to steal that, Dan, and use it everywhere I can. How would I know if this wasn't? How would I know if this was a scam or not?
Yeah.
I'm, as an author myself, I'm intrigued by the collaboration between the two of you. I honestly simply can't imagine collaborating with anybody except maybe my puppy. I mean, beyond that, it's just hard for me to imagine. And yet, I can tell you from having, or tell our audience from having read an advanced copy of the book, that it seems so seamless. I could not tell you which of you wrote which parts of either of the two books. So can you tell us a little bit about your process, your process as researchers, as writers, as revisers, and editing, which is, as we know, at least 50% of the work of the book. Were there a lot of arguments? Were there's a lot of drinking involved? I mean, what did you do?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'd say is that, as scientists, a lot of what we do is collaborative, right? So we'll work with students, we'll work with other scientists, and when we finish our research and we have to write it up for a journal article, for a scientific publication, it's inherently collaborative, right? So somebody might write a first draft, but then it has to go back and forth and everybody has to approve the final version. So, and Chris and I have collaborated on research for 25 years. So we have a lot of experience with that style of collaboration, and we collaborate with many other people, right? So that sort of interactive writing process is something we both have done a lot of. I would say that we're both very good editors of each other's writing. So, we'll have a turn of phrase that we think is wonderful and perfect and the best metaphor that we could possibly use. And, Chris will look at it and say, that doesn't make any sense. Or, that doesn't hold together. And
Right.
we'll end up kind of constraining our sort of phrasing to be coherent. But in terms of actually just the writing process, we'll each write some sections, but they'll go back and forth, a dozen times before we're settled on it. So I often don't know. I mean, I know which sections that we started it with. So I wrote a lot of the sections on science fraud because that's something I've done a lot more work in. Chris wrote most of the sections on chess because he's a chess master. But we pass those back and forth to the point that for any given phrase, I'm not always sure who wrote it. If it has a lot of commas, it was probably Chris.
I have to give you a chance to respond to that.
Yeah.
It's going to be a very long sentence with many commas. Is my response is going to be that. I think Dan does Dan sands down all of my attempts at making fanciful sentence constructions with unusual words and so on, which probably readers are grateful for if they knew it was happening. We do have different writing styles, but like Dan said, we've been working together for so long that we sort of blended together fairly easily. I mean, one of the things I really like about this book and about our previous book and the process is getting to write something completely for an audience that's not our own colleagues, even though, at least in the case of The Invisible Gorilla, it turned out to be a useful book for many of our colleagues, especially in teaching and so on. But the goal is not to communicate with other psychologists or behavioral scientists. And I think that in a way, it's not like explain it to me like I'm 5, but it is explain it to me like I don't know all the stuff you already know, which is a lot different style of communication, and really I think helps us, or at least me, understand things more deeply, but also understand how they apply, to the broader world, which I think is a very undervalued skill in academia sometimes. I think a lot of, even in psychology, which is very much about sort of how people think and decide and live, there's a lot of research that goes into these sort of little theoretical rabbit holes, or winds up sort of only talking to other researchers, and it's not really clear what would be the implication of one team being right and the other team being wrong even. And not to say, of course, that basic research isn't important and so on, but I like to try to make the connections apparent. That just brings me that just brings me joy. And it's especially good to do with someone else, I think, because it's really hard to figure out all of the implications and possible meanings and applications of this work. But two heads are definitely better than one in that respect.
Well, I admire the extent to which the voice in which the book is written is so consistent. I mean, there is an avatar that's a combination of both of you that
it's
is
probably
consistent.
A bald guy in their 50s. Yeah.
Right. But it's consistent all through the book, and it's a truism in my world as well, as a lifelong journalist, that you have to understand something so deeply to be able to explain it simply. That before you can simplify something, you must have an absolute, thorough, detailed grasp of all of the complexities, or else your analogies will run off the rails and your examples won't work. So obviously both of you are bringing a great depth of science, but I can attest to our audience here that the result is an extremely accessible book. I mean, it's fun to read. The examples are human and interesting, and sometimes tragically funny, but it really has, you've achieved, I think, what your hope was, which is talking to us where we are, not where you are in terms of your knowledge of the story. But it's but what was there some sticking point? There must have been in a book like this. There must have been. And I've been there. Listen, I'm with just the book I just finished. There were things where I planted my flag on that hill. I am not changing this paragraph, however much my editor wants me to do it. Were there moments like that for you too, where you said, sorry, Chris, or sorry, Dan, you're wrong about this. It stands the way I wrote it.
Sure. I mean, I don't think there were any that were huge structural things. We had to kind of work through some of the organizational issues, right? So how much of the framing do we put up front? We had differences with, our editors about, how much should go in the intro, for example, how much content should be in the introductory section, how deep should it be, as opposed to how breezy, right? And that's always, there are always trade-offs, right? You want the book to move quickly, but you also don't want to leave out the critical elements that are necessary to understand. And
right.
So there's a balancing. I don't know that we had any that were kind of, I'm sure there were phrases here and there. It's like, yeah, I want it this way. And it's like, okay,
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was very interesting to me how varied the opinions that people have on the way an introduction to a 250-page nonfiction book should be, or even a nonfiction book of any length. And so far is the point that I started pulling books off my shelves, and as you can see, I have quite a few. And literally looking at the introduction and counting the number of pages and making a little list and so on. And it turns out, of course, there's a wide range of things. And sometimes people say like, well, you're throat clearing. And I think one person's throat clearing is another person's, critical important facts that they want the reader to be aware of before we dive into the next thing, or one thing setting the scene, that people should be aware of. So I would say actually the introduction is the thing that we had sort of the most lengthy discussion and dispute and so on about. And, maybe, I hope it came out well. And, as you mentioned earlier, I would say, readers should be sure to check the footnotes, because a lot of times the author's favorite little points, and the funniest things and the most ironic things and so on, you have to put in the footnotes because they're too digressive for the main text. So read the footnotes.
Yeah.
Read the footnotes.
Or the end notes, the end notes. Yes, the end notes, I should say. Yeah.
We all agree on that. Please read my end notes.
There's fun stuff. There's always fun stuff buried in the end notes.
There is.
Yes.
Dan and Chris, this new book is coming out during really a boom time for disinformation and conspiracy theories, not just in the United States, although we seem to be, from a historic standpoint, peculiarly infected with them at the moment, but really in a lot of modern societies. What does Nobody's Fool have to teach us about how to navigate this cultural moment more successfully? How do you think we can cultivate the necessary skepticism without becoming just debilitatingly cynical about everything that we hear?
That's a real challenge, right? That, and I think there's a danger in that there are so many scams and cons across so many fields, right? So many areas that they're gradually, and there's so much entertaining coverage of them, right? I mean, you can watch movies, you can listen to podcasts, you can watch interviews, read articles. And what we kind of noticed was that, yeah, they're great storytelling. They make really compelling examples. And then we don't seem to kind of learn from them, right? Because we're not able to spot the new variant when it comes along if all we've done is watched an in-depth story about one case. So our hope is that by covering how all of these scams across a wide range of things, everything from art and science fraud to financial fraud to chess cheating to science cheating. I mean, if you see how they have the same principles, how they rely on the same sort of underlying tendencies and ways of thinking, that maybe when something new comes along, you'll have the tools, recognize the similarities and say, okay, yeah, this is something that looks a lot like that art cheating case, right? Even though it's a Bitcoin scam, right? Or a crypto scam, right? And I think that's our hope, is that by looking at what's common. So we don't dive into depth in any one scam in the way that you did for Bernie Madoff, for example. But that's a really essential thing to do. We don't do that in the same level of depth because we want to show what's similar about that case and Theranos and Bitcoin, not Bitcoin, but crypto scams or chess
Crypto
cheating, and
scams, yeah.
they all have some similar characteristics, even though they superficially are completely different.
Right.
Chris, you chime in.
Yeah, with regard to misinformation and disinformation, you know, that's been around for a long time, right? There are,
Yes.
you know, all kinds of forgeries going back thousands of years, and all kinds of anti-Semitic things and so on. And I don't know whether it seems to be at a high right now, and maybe it actually is, or maybe technology just makes it easier to, you know, to spread it around more. I think I believe that people don't want to spread misinformation. So I don't think our book has much hope of, you know, getting Vladimir Putin to close down his troll farms or whatever, because that's a strategic, political, international operation. But I think most of the people who pass around what comes from the troll farms don't want to spread misinformation, and they do care about whether things are true or not. Most people, maybe not some politicians and so on. But they still do it anyhow. And that is where I think there can be some hope. So people should be aware that when they see some news story, you know, that is forwarded by a friend on Facebook or whatever, well, the fact that it comes from your friend has disarmed you a little bit and made you more likely to believe it's true, because why would your friend tell you false information?
Right.
And the fact that you agree with it should actually be a sign that you may be being lured into spreading fake news. We have a sort of surprise instinct inherently. If we disagree with something, if it surprises us, then we do, you know, raise our guard a little bit and start to check things out. But now with social media enabling, you know, our friends to be the transmission channels of falsehoods that they haven't checked out very much, we need to be more aware that when things match our expectations and they come from familiar sources, we need to check them out more. And incidentally, I was looking at the Q&A window and someone typed something like, you know, why should we even trust you guys, or something like that, you know, LOL. That's a good question, right? You're starting to ask the right questions. Like it's, you know, you probably trust Mark Twain, you know, House as a credible organization, and they probably wouldn't get, you know, some AI generated bots to be on the camera and so on. But you should be asking that maybe more often. But on the other hand, you shouldn't just automatically distrust everybody, right? You should probably try to have a little bit of a more logical process for, you know, for sifting those sources.
You know, social media and internet reviews and you know, online commentary of all sorts have become such a basic part of our lives. I think many of us would be shocked to learn how easily manipulated those sources of information have become. I mean, I know I was personally shocked that people would, you know, team up to give 1-star reviews to authors for books that they haven't even read, just as a personal attack on the author. Well, Lord, you know, that's horrible. People will believe that those are real reviews. So help us see, maybe a better way to put this is, how will Nobody's Fool help us navigate through those environments like Yelp and Amazon reviews and Google information and Google News and Facebook? How these are for many people, not just people my age, but for even people in their 40s and 50s, these are relatively new additions to our information mix. I grew up on newspapers that were thrown on my front step and 3 stations on the television at night. So what does Nobody's Fool teach us about how to navigate this new information environment?
And I'd say review sites are really challenging, right? Because you really have no idea who the people are who are writing the reviews and what techniques they're using to gain your attention. I think my favorite example of the sort of 1-star versus 5-star reviews was a book from Paul Offit, who's a virology expert. He was one of the inventors of the RSV vaccine, rotavirus vaccine years and years ago. And his book came out, and the day it was out, it had no 3-star reviews. Everything was 1-star or 5-star. And there were a bunch of them, right? Because all of the anti-vaxxers who didn't read the book went and gave it 1-star. All of the vaccine proponents gave it 5-star. And there was nobody who was actually evaluating the content of the book. And it was a great book, but it wasn't It wasn't what was actually being reviewed. And that's a real challenge, that there are a lot of fake reviews. There are also a lot of fake listings. So one thing that just came out a day or so ago as something to watch out for is when you do a Google search, sometimes you'll have paid results, advertisements at the top, right? Be really careful about that, because scammers are paying for advertisements to mimic the real site when it's not actually their site. So there were people getting fooled by airlines when they were trying to change their tickets. They were going and seeing a paid ad that wasn't actually Delta or United Airlines. It was a scammer who recreated a site and then basically tried to get you to pay to change your ticket at a much higher level. Right. So watching out for those advertised ones, which might not be as carefully vetted as the actual search results, as an example. But a lot of those are going to be specific cases. I mean, reviews have become less trustworthy. It's really hard to know.
It really is. I loved your earlier question, and it probably applies here. How would I know if this was a scam? How would I know that if this is an illegitimate review? That we rely to some extent on the platform owners on Amazon and Yelp and places like that to police it, but evidence is that's not working out very well. Chris, do you have some additional advice to add on that?
Yes. I think the example of the book with the 5-star and 1-star reviews makes a good point, which is that we can't often just trust the first piece of information that we see about something anymore. For example, this is a 3-star book. Like, as we all know, reviews are so highly skewed now that a 3-star book is a bad book. Or at least there are many books that are much higher rated than 3 stars, but this is not a 3-star book, right? This is a book that some people think is a 5-star book and some people think is a 1-star book. And so once you see that, you've gone one level deeper and you said, wait a minute, this is weird. This is not going on. And something weird is happening here. You may then look at the 1-stars and the 5-stars and see that the 1-stars are ranting about conspiracies, about vaccines and so on, whereas the 5-star books, 5-star reviews, say something different. I think that's an example also of how, well, let me shift a tiny bit. Like one problem we see in science fraud, and you'll see what the connection is in a second, is with all these multi-author papers that Dan was mentioning before and all these collaborations and so on, people are doing so much, working so fast that often people don't even sufficiently check their own work or the work of their collaborators and wind up sort of getting sucked into, being parts of these things. We are working too fast in many cases. And you don't need to make a decision usually as fast as you think you do, especially a purchasing decision. Look at what the reviews say. Look at how credible the authors seem. Look at there's various things you can do, but
look to see if the person's reviewed other things.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, exactly. Look at that. Look at how many ones they've done. Often you can see like who the sock puppets are if you look a little more. But another alternative is go to a more trusted source than internet reviews. Frankly, internet reviews are not my most trusted source for any kind of decision making. I'll ask my friends who live in New York City, like what restaurants I should go to when I'm there or something like that. Or I will, well, if I get the chance, I'll ask you what books I should read about financial history or fraud or something like that. Sort of come up with the old fashioned kind of sources, which they often might be a little harder to access. And they sort of seem superficially less authoritative. It's just one person instead of 300, but it's harder to be defrauded by your friend who has some idea what kind of food you like to eat and doesn't want you to have a bad experience on their, on their recommendation.
Yeah. They might be wrong, but they're not.
That's true. But but at least there's some expertise that you know is there. Yeah. And how much has the attack on expertise that's been part of our political discourse for the past 30, 40 years? I've seen it in the world of finance. I'm sure you've seen it in the worlds of science and psychology, that you can't trust the experts. What do they know, right? That there's been this steady sanding away of the sharp edges of actual knowledge, actual expertise. Once everyone's on the internet, everyone's got an opinion, but that doesn't mean it's an informed opinion. Is there a way that we can evaluate in a trustworthy way what people's expertise is, what they bring to the party here as advisors to us? How do you guys decide whose advice you accept and whose you don't?
It's a really challenging question, right? Because there are plenty of examples of experts being badly wrong about things too. And figuring out which experts know and which experts don't is a real challenge. So we see a lot of sort of popular psychology books that will go and quote one person who is a purported expert, but we know that that person's full of it, right? They don't actually know what they're talking about. And if you're not in that field, you might not know that that work just isn't going to hold up, or it's not really that good. And it's really hard to figure that out as an outsider.
Right.
As a journalist, one thing that I recommend to journalists when they're doing an interview is to ask everybody, who are some people who would disagree with you, right? And go and interview those people too. And don't necessarily trust that they'll tell you people who actually disagree. But if you ask everybody that, you'll eventually find some people who are critical. And then you have to evaluate, are the critical claims plausible, right? Are they believable? What would be a different perspective? Or why shouldn't I believe you? What would be reasons why I would not believe you? Because, you know, a lot of people want to kind of promote their ideas, and they do that in a way that's superficial. They don't kind of get into the nuance. And if you read press releases for science, you'll often get this sort of version of the study that has nothing to do with the study, right? And that's a real challenge for people who aren't experts in the field. So checking with experts and checking with multiple experts can be a really good way to do it. Chris, you look like you're about to pound something.
Of course, I always open my mouth. I'm about to say something. Well, for one thing, you know, credentials are real, right? So we can always look at credentials, and frankly, you know, if I move to a new town and I'm trying to find a new doctor to be my primary care doctor, I look at where their education was from. I look at where they did their residency and so on. It may seem superficial, but on the other hand, I think that's better than reading those star reviews that you can find on their web pages, which are probably curated and, you know, and so on. But, you know, I think the other thing is it's really a good signal to pay attention to is how often people express absolute certainty. And the more often they express absolute certainty, the less you should probably use them as a source. And the more often they seem to be willing to admit that they don't know, or to say, you know, the weight of the evidence points this direction, you know, a couple people, those are maybe the more credible sources to pay attention to. And I think that, you know, one thing that's happened over the last few years is that well-meaning people, you know, have expressed too much certainty about things that even if they were experts in, maybe they were not as certain as they said, but often they didn't have the expertise in, but they were sort of vaguely adjacent, right? So, you know, doctors who aren't infectious disease specialists telling us all about COVID treatments or something like that would be an example. You've got to look at the credentials, I would say, and the willingness to admit what they don't know. And there's no perfect rule here, right? But those things I think can be still helpful.
Of course, the media doesn't help in this environment when it demands certainty about things that we cannot be certain about. It's less careful and I say this as a lifelong, you know, practitioner of the profession. It's harder and harder to be careful about what the antecedents and the expertise and the motives of the people that you're talking to may be, and the time pressure. And when, you know, once upon a time, you know, I had to file a story by 11:30 at night, and it would be in the next day's New York Times, and people would read it. Now, my colleagues at the paper have to file, you know, every 15, 20 minutes when there's an update in the activity. And one of the things that we had hammered into us was in those early drafts, in those early breaking news reports that go out on the web, it was critical that we put in those stories what we did not yet know. It is not yet clear who, and there's been no information about, and we don't know. And hopefully you're meanwhile trying desperately to fill in those holes, but you don't just put the story out there without acknowledging that there's still a lot more information to come. There's so much more to do it. Now, this is a skill set that I think my whole profession is still learning. And it's a moving target because we're dealing with people who are far more careless with the truth than anybody I ever dealt with in my professional career. So you have to do constant fact checking at the same time. But I think that your advice to the media is, you know, is great, and one that they should absolutely take to heart.
I was going to say it's a real challenge because, of course, there are the incentives for a competitive business with so many voices blasting out nonsense is to draw readers and listeners. And, you know, that means we talk about one example where we were completely fooled by a headline in a mainstream, top-notch newspaper, right? Because the headline writer maybe didn't really fully understand what the article was about. The article was fine.
Well, I would say
that
as both
happens.
a newspaper reporter and a former headline writer,
Yeah, it's
if
hard.
the headline writer couldn't figure out what the story was clearly about, it wasn't just the headline writer's fault.
Oh, yeah.
It's the
Yeah.
reporter's job to make sure that a desperate copy editor on deadline trying to write a quick, accurate headline can figure it out from your story fairly quickly.
But it's a real challenge because it's
It
kind
is
of
a
like a game
challenge.
of telephone, right? Because the headline writer
is.
wasn't doing the research, right? They weren't
Right.
doing the reporting.
Right.
And then the people they were reporting on might have been not fully immersed in what was happening. So you end up getting this sort of
Right.
transmission over time that, can end up leading to something that's maybe not quite right.
Right. Well,
but
and
still very appealing. Yeah.
your key question is still a good one. How would I know if this story isn't true?
Right.
How would I know if the story wasn't accurate? Could I check to other sources? Could I check in other ways?
Yeah.
I want to ask Omar now if we have questions that we haven't covered that we should field from the audience that's been listening in. I haven't been able to keep track of all the busy chat that's been going on. Wonderful group. But what else should we be touching on here? Interest that people have that we haven't touched on.
There have been a lot of comments, but since we're talking about the media, someone did ask, will this book help us understand how people can still believe that Trump won the 2020 election?
Oh, I love that. I love that question. Bravo to whoever posted it. Terrific. Okay. I will say, God, I hope so. But to you guys, how does it help? How will this book help?
I could take a stab at
Chris.
that one. So without taking a position on who won the 2020 election, although I do think that it's pretty obvious who won the 2020 election and he's president right now, I think there are a lot of concepts in our book that actually do point towards an explanation for why people would believe the opposite. And one of them, and you can almost run through the whole book, because I think the notion that Trump won the election is the kind of level of disinformation and misinformation that really requires a lot of different cognitive mechanisms to explain how something so contrary to fact could get into so many people's minds, right? It's not just like one weird trick, So, well, there are some obvious things like repetition. So the more often you hear a claim being made, the more likely you are to believe that it's true. There's also commitment. So if you're committed to the idea that Trump, was a great president and is a political genius and is one of the greatest leaders of our time, well, anything that he says, you're going to be more likely to accept, or at least you're going to rationalize away evidence that contradicts what he says. So there's commitment. There's also the notion of focus. So if you are focused on information from one source, you may not be looking enough at information from other sources. So if you get all your news from, a certain small handful of channels that all believe that Trump won the election, or at least they're promoting that story, whether they believe it or not, at least they're promoting that. And then also there's an interesting one we haven't touched on in this conversation is this notion of precision. So information stated with claims stated with precision are more likely to be accepted as true than claims stated, more vaguely or less concretely. This is often why advertisers like to tell you, it kills 99% of viruses or something like that, as opposed to very good against viruses, So a lot of the claims about the election do involve various precise things like certain numbers of ballots that were delivered in the middle of the night and all kinds of specific numeric things about the number of votes that weren't counted and so on. And I think when you hear statements like that, it sounds like there must have been some sort of deep investigation and thorough understanding, behind making those precise claims. But although it's true that if someone does do a thorough investigation and has a deep understanding, for example, someone who spent a long time on the Bernie Madoff story, they might be able to tell us some precise things about it. It doesn't mean that anyone who's telling us precise things has done all of that work objectively, right? So we make the mistake when we go in the other direction. And that's just the 4 or 5 things that I was able to think of in 30 seconds.
Yeah.
There's a lot more probably.
Right. Dan?
I think commitment is really the key for why people, so there are lots of reasons why people would come to a mistaken belief. Why people would hold on to it, I think, is more often driven by that commitment, right? So if you start with that assumption that Bernie would never screw us, you'll rationalize away all sorts of problems, right? And you'll convince yourself that they aren't problems, right? And the same thing can happen if you are convinced that Trump always tells the truth, you'll go through all sorts of sort of reasoning to try and make things that are completely contradictory cohesive, right? And once you go down that path, once you kind of commit to that initial assumption, it's really hard to take a step back. That's why when outsiders look at people in a cult, right, who do all sorts of bizarre things, it's obvious to the outsiders that something's wrong, but it's not at all obvious to the insiders because they're completely rational in their reasoning, given that starting assumption, right? So if you start with the assumption that Trump would never lie, right, and you hold to that fast, you have to do a lot of other careful logic to kind of make things hold together. And it seems like you can build up sort of a worldview that is completely divorced from the worldview of somebody who doesn't have that assumption. And it's a real challenge to sort of say, how do you fix that? How do you get people to take a step back and say, okay, is my assumption right here?
Yeah.
And
Let's talk a little
really
bit.
hard.
Let's talk a little bit because it is so important. And I think it's one of the reasons that nobody's fool comes at the exact moment when it is most needed. And that it can be so helpful to us. But let's talk a little bit about how do we, among our friends, among our families, our acquaintances, how do we address that disconnect from expertise, rationality, skepticism? How do we address that among ourselves so that we is there a way to bring people a little closer to awareness about the truth that you think would work? You guys are the experts about how our minds are screwing us up here, but what would you prescribe? It's Thanksgiving dinner. I'm sitting there with a host of family members who think that Trump won the election. What works to try to persuade people to open their minds a little bit wider?
I'd say go watch the football game. No, I'm just kidding. But I think, after you've read Nobody's Fool, I would really recommend this book, How Minds Change by David McRaney, who's an excellent author. And his book is basically all about how people change their mind about important topics. For example, people who were opposed to gay marriage, but then many people 10 years later saw no problem with it. And he also talks about people who believed things like 9/11 conspiracy theories, who that became part of their identity, but yet still at some point they were able to change their mind. And I don't want to try to explain sort of David's arguments, but one element of it might be just to get people to think about what if this premise of yours wasn't true? So what if it wasn't true that such and such? Just get people to like hypothetically entertain the possibility that, if something they believe wasn't true, what else would change and so on. It's a very, it's not arguing. It's not according to, David and a lot of other people I think have looked at this. It's not telling people, well, you're wrong about this business of the ballot boxes in the middle of the night and you're wrong about that. It's more like sort of trying to help them unpack their own logic for why they have come to these conclusions, because there is inevitably some logic. As Dan said, it's logic to believe all of this if your premise is Trump is always telling the truth. So if you could get people to sort of see that explicitly, they might realize, oh, wait a minute, there's something here. And maybe a lot of times one Thanksgiving dinner is not going to do it, but there was a slow process usually of change. It seems to happen like very suddenly, but there's actually under the surface there's been a lot of evolution going on that we just don't see in practice. If
you're far enough down that rabbit hole with all of the sorts of conspiratorial sort of ideas, it takes a while to kind of get all the way back up to the top of the hole, right? But and even being able to figure out what the initial premise is, what the initial assumption or set of assumptions was that led people down that hole in the first place, getting people to realize that that's what it was, right? That's where they started, and to apply the logic that they do have, even if it's just a hypothetical, even just thinking, okay, what if I were wrong? How would that look?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, one of the questions I always advise young investigative reporters to ask themselves is, if this thesis is true, who would know it? Who would have the evidence? What would the evidence be? I mean, try to imagine that you actually have to write a newspaper story proving that the 2020 election was rigged. What evidence would you need? And who would have it? And why would they share it with you? I mean, to me, one of the most dispositive aspects of this whole election fraud game is, I mean, how many people would have had to know what was happening? And what are the odds that not one of them would have said a word about it at the time? And I can tell you, as an investigative reporter, I've gotten a lot of people to talk to me about frauds going on under their noses. That is just not happening. That is impossible. That the number of people who would have been needed to carry out this rigging could have done it without a single leaker, without a single protest, without a single anonymous letter to a reporter. So, you know, the absence of evidence, which is often the hardest thing to persuade people with, there's no evidence of this, is nevertheless sometimes the most conclusive proof that you have. There's just no evidence that has come to the surface at all to support that claim. But again, that does take time. Are we, Omar, do we have other questions from the audience? I don't want to leave them out of it in our last few minutes here.
We had one question about explaining things to people, but you guys naturally went there. We have no further questions.
I do see a chat item here that I'd love to touch on, just because I love librarians, and this is from a librarian. She or he, actually it's a he, says that one of the biggest challenges that he faces talking about this, critical thinking is what I think we're talking about here with students, is the resistance to taking the time to research your sources. So what's your advice to careful people like Eric, the librarians and teachers and those who are trying to raise up a culture of critical thinkers who won't be anybody's fool, to borrow from your title?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's something that, when I've taught introductory psychology classes to freshmen, one of my standard assignments is, hey, here's a list of 10 books. I want you to evaluate how credible they are about the science, right? And these are people who don't really know the science yet, right? They're beginning.
Right.
So
right.
They aren't capable of evaluating it directly themselves, but they can evaluate, okay, this is a trade book. Should I believe what they're selling, right? And how do you go about evaluating that? And looking at the sources and citations, seeing whether they seem credible, looking at the author and whether they have any training, looking at the author and doing a search on Google Scholar to see, have they published anything on these sorts of areas? So do they actually have credibility as a researcher if they're writing about research? That's not always necessary, but if they aren't credible as a researcher themselves, do they talk to the right people? So you can do a search on the topic and say, okay, who has written a lot about this topic? Who's published scientific articles about this topic? And are they people who are mentioned in the book? Are they cited? So it's kind of a sequence of things that people can do to kind of look at the credibility of a source. You can't always do it, right? You sometimes don't even have that. So some books are.
I love that idea, because what you're saying is, you don't need to be an expert on this subject matter to learn how to be more expert at assessing the credibility of this source of subject matter.
Does the source get who the experts are? Who are the experts? Is the source tapping them?
Right.
Typically, if you're getting one side of a debate, right? If a book is out there and it's pushing for one position, and often it's pushing for this one trick that will solve a problem, just be skeptical of those. Right? They're almost never right.
Chris, I love to hear what you have to say about this.
No, I think the same uncertainty principle applies a little bit there too, right? Sort of the more certain some source is in some dramatic conclusion, right? That everything's a fraud, and we're sure of it. The less weight you should put on it. I liked someone made a comment here in the chat about asking people for sources on social media, because it's sometimes people have them, but it's amazing how often people are just passing along things that have no source, right? And that by itself is or they don't know the source, right? So it's sort of like, if you don't even know the source where you got something, then you are less credible, and you should believe it less yourself. As for how to get 15-year-olds to research more sources and spend more time on that as opposed to video games, I wish I knew more about that, but I'm sure it's always been a challenge, down through history, getting the 15-year-olds to do what they're supposed to.
That's certainly true, but I will say that it won't be hard for a 15-year-old to read Nobody's Fool. It's fun, it's entertaining, and my hope is that we could sort of inculcate a culture where the gotcha moment, the joy of exposing a fraud, exposing a hoax, becomes at least as much fun as spreading one. I mean, and that's really the fact-checking mentality, the Snopes.com mentality, the idea of debunking widely held misinformation. I think if we can get kids turned on about how much fun that can be, that would be a big step forward.
Let's write a Netflix pilot about a hero who exposes frauds and cons and so on, and that'll teach everybody how to do this, right?
And we'll make him a mild-mannered psychologist. Working as a team, of course, collaborating together
with a financial journalist too.
I'm in.
Yeah,
I'm in. I think it sounds like fun. Go take this act on the road. Well, thank you both for your time and for your comments this morning, and especially thank you for Nobody's Fool. As I've said, I think it's a tremendous addition to our understanding about how we get in our own way when we're trying to sort fact from fiction in this world. So I've enjoyed being part of the panel, and I will leave it to Omar to say the farewells for us.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you for acting as moderator. Thanks, Dan and Chris, for your awesome book, and all three of you for this great conversation. And thank you to our audience for joining us. Please join us again for another program or for a tour at the museum. And have a great afternoon.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.